Hello again. This is In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder, and I have a guest all the way. In fact, it doesn't really matter because in this global sort of digital world, it doesn't matter where you are, because in the past you could say all the way from, but in reality, it's all very, very close by. In fact, we'll be talking tonight with Karen Bakker, Dr. Karen Bakker. Karen, may I call you Dr. Karen or just Karen?
Oh, please. I'm a recovering academic, so you should definitely call me Karen.
And how are you and where are you, Karen?
So I'm in Vancouver, Canada. It's a sunny day after a stormy night with beautiful sun and snow on the mountains. So I'm feeling quite just enthralled, really, by the water in the mountains that I can see out my window as I'm speaking to you.
It's funny, I've excuse me, up until last year, I've only ever been to Canada once. It was for 45 minutes on the tarmac of Nova Scotia.
Okay.
And it was a rainy day.
Mm.
And I really want to experience Canada much more than that. So what are the sort of the best selling points for those like myself to come, to encourage myself and other people to come to Canada?
Oh, I mean, Canada's spans a continent and three oceans, so it's got a little bit of everything from, Montreal, which is sort of the best of North America combined with the best of Europe, right? Francophone city, amazing culture. And then, of course, it's got just expansive nature, however you might like to experience it, from the prairies to the great tundra to the boreal to the Rocky Mountains. I mean, it. I've lived in England and I've lived in Europe and lived in many places all over the world, each of, which has something wonderful to offer. But there is something remarkable about getting up in the morning and going outside and hearing an eagle cry overhead. And that's the kind of city Vancouver is. It's still sort of on the edge of lots of interesting non-human communities. And that's one of the reasons I love it here.
It sounds amazing. For those who don't know Karen, in fact, before I even tell you about Karen, I must not forget to say that this is sponsored. This whole In Conservation With series has been sponsored by Leica Sport Optic and CJ Wildlife. Apologies for the coughing. Anyway, just to explain about Karen, she is a Canadian author. She's a researcher and a social impact tech entrepreneur, which is an interesting phrase, which I'd like to find out exactly what that means. And through the Smart Earth project, she's exploring how the tools of the digital age could be mobilized to solve the most pressing challenges of the Anthropocene, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and the future of work. All very interesting sort of subjects that I'd like to sort of unwrap a little bit. You're known for your work on digital transformation, environmental governance, and sustainability. And she is a Rhodes Scholar with a PhD from Oxford, a professor at the University of British Columbia, a Guggenheim Fellow. I love the Guggenheim, by the way, and a Fellow of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And today we're going to be chatting about sound, for want of a more expansive and complicated explanation, because for me it's about sound. Correct me if I'm wrong. And also the fact that she's written this incredible book which called The Sounds of Life. And what's interesting about your book, Karen, I didn't say this to you at the time, was that I often, when I get books from people, I often just hand them to someone who's not even interested in the subject and see if it passes the first page test or even the first chapter test. And I gave it to someone who had no interest, she's not involved in our world at all. And I heard silence. And I said, well, what do you think? And she said, this is really interesting. I didn't know this. I didn't know that. And it just carried on to the point that I had to actually say, look, I need to take the book back because I need it today. So that's I think, a good enough as any endorsement for your book. So well done for writing it. Thank you very much for doing it. But let's get back to just excuse me, if you could just quickly, for those who may be puzzled by the term social impact tech
Oh,
entrepreneur. What does that mean?
right. So thank you for all of that, and I'm really looking forward to talking about the book. Briefly, social impact technology, digital tech is a term that's used to describe people who are using digital technology for broadly social good goals. That might be environmental sustainability, it might be equity, diversity, and inclusion, and there are an amazing number of scientists who are trying to develop digital tools that, for example, can support people's well-being, increase their participation in environmental conservation, meet people where they're at, wherever they are. So that's what social impact tech is, perhaps in contrast to big tech. Maybe it's like a small is beautiful version of tech. You can think of it that way.
Yeah, interesting. I kind of, when I look at anything, I try and think in very simple terms. So please correct me if I'm too simple. But your book, The Sounds of Life, for me it made me realize just how impoverished our lives as humans are in some respect, because you discuss how sound is a major thing in this world, in the planet. I mean, you know, in the book you talk about the fact that the earth itself makes noise that we as humans we don't actually pick up on, or very rarely, if we do, we pick up maybe not so much hearing it but feeling it. And I just kind of think to myself, well, I mean, you're the best person to kind of summarize what the book's about, but I think to myself, the first question that comes to my mind straight away is, why do humans have such a narrow range of hearing, and what the hell are we missing?
Yeah, I mean, these are profound questions, and you've summarized it beautifully. I'll just, for listeners, give a little bit more of context. So, human hearing range is relatively narrow compared to all of the sounds that are out there in nature. Many of the sounds made by plants, animals, insects, and the earth itself occur above our hearing range in what's called the ultrasound, or below our human hearing range in what is called the infrasound. So we, as humans, we're pretty self-centered. We tend to assume that what we cannot perceive does not exist. So we sort of blithely walk around oblivious to the fact that there's a lot of noise in nature. Silence is an illusion. We can be out in the forest and thinking, oh, it's so quiet, but it's full of noise. We just can't hear it. I'll give you one example that might surprise people. The famous mating dance of the peacock, the beautiful tail, the lustrous feathers. So we've known, in fact, we've domesticated peacocks for millennia, but only recently did we figure out that mating display, which we think of as a visual display, is actually an acoustic display. The peacock's tail is like a bioacoustic resonator. It makes a very loud sound in the infrasound below our human hearing range. We cannot hear that, but the peacocks, and most importantly, the peahens, can hear that sound. So the peacock is giving a rock concert. We can't hear a thing. And how curious that we've known and lived pretty intimately with these birds for such a long time, and we only recently figured this out, because we only recently basically started asking ourselves, what if that creature was making noise at a frequency that I couldn't hear? And the reason that we're able to answer that what if question with respect to all sorts of species now is because a new generation of digital technology is now available that, much like your smartphone, is pretty cheap. It's portable, it's lightweight, it's got long battery life, and you can automate a lot of these digital recording devices. And so what scientists are doing is just installing these everywhere on the planet, on the backs of whales, on mountaintops, at the bottom of the ocean. And what we're hearing is astounding. The world is full of sound. And, that sound is made by living organisms, biophony. It's also made by the planet. If you could hear in the deep infrasound, like a whale or an elephant, you could hear thunderstorms dozens or hundreds of miles away. The Earth itself even has a sort of an infrasound heartbeat. It's caused by the crashing of ocean waves over continental shelves, or earthquakes, which sort of create infrasonic tremors in the atmosphere, like a very quiet bell. So all of that sound pretty much passes humans by. Now, you asked why. Though humans are very visually oriented, partly it's to do with being a species that evolved on land. Aquatic creatures see the world through sound because sound travels much better underwater than light. If you've ever done any diving, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can hear things a lot further away than you can see them. So one of the reasons that we are so poor of hearing is physiological. Our ears just can't hear above or below a certain hearing range, although a very rare set of humans can actually echo range in the frequencies that would overlap with bats, for example. But I think another reason that we are unable to hear these sounds is we don't cultivate the art of listening. That is, we probably have a latent ability to hear a lot more sounds than we actually are thinking we're hearing, but we filter them out. And we filter them out, particularly living in modern, industrialized, urbanized societies. And the book is full of examples of traditional societies where the art of hearing is cultivated and they can actually hear much better than, let's say, the Western scientists whose stories I tell in the book.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that about hearing, because it's like when I go birding, I hear things and other people don't. And sometimes I'm with other birders who hear things and I don't. But then when I tune myself into it, I actually can hear it. And I remember speaking to a hearing, an organization that provides hearing aids for people. And they said that sometimes people, they train their brain to say, right, you have to hear this because it's out there. And you kind of make yourself hear it. Whereas if you sort of blindly walk through life, you wouldn't hear it because you're not trained your brain. You haven't sort of focused your sense. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I think it's particularly the case in cultures that put a high emphasis on literacy and reading. So, in cultures that prioritize orality in terms of spoken and hearing, there is much more attunement to sounds made by humans and other species from an early age, and that can be cultivated, much like we would cultivate the art of playing a musical instrument. The ability to train your brain to listen for these very subtle sounds can indeed be cultivated, and it's something that we simply don't generally practice. Again, I'm speaking not the royal we, but specifically about modern Western science has not put much emphasis into the art of listening. And so that's why I say in the book, which tells these wonderful stories of all of these sounds made by species that science previously thought were mute and deaf, like not only whales and elephants, but bats and turtles and coral and even plants, okay, that much of these findings that are sort of marvelous and really enthralling, those are rediscoveries. Robin Wall Kimmerer, the Potawatomi biologist, who writes so beautifully in Braiding Sweetgrass, she has a lovely quote. She says, "I smile when my scientific colleagues say that they have discovered something. That's like Columbus saying they discovered America. Rather, what we are doing," she says, "when we practice science is patiently asking questions, and nature gives us the answers. Nature holds that knowledge, and indigenous communities often hold that knowledge." So throughout the book, I try to balance these really exciting findings of that scientists are making using digital tools, digital listening, with this ancient art of deep listening out in nature, unmediated, that also is very powerful as a sort of means of revealing the hidden knowledge of nature.
It's absolutely incredible. Excuse me. We'll come back to some of the sort of stories that you talked about in terms of whales and stuff, because I'm really quite keen for you to share your knowledge on that. But I guess this next question statement, I guess, should really come at the end. But this really feels like a complete and utter flipping on the head of our perception of life, because we open our eyes, we look around, and we just say, right, that's there, so it's there. Obviously there's more to life than meets the eye, and this flips it completely on the head, doesn't it?
Well, yes, at many levels. So one insight to offer is that the world is full of not only sound, but communication between and within species. So the book goes into some detail on, for example, all of the marvelous ways that bats communicate and their rich social lives that we have actually begun to decode using artificial intelligence and these digital recording devices. So many other species are capable of complex social behaviors that we previously didn't suspect. For example, bats engage in vocal learning, something that scientists thought was only reserved for a few species, notably humans. But the way that this research decenters humans in another way is that we're slowly growing aware of all these interspecies conversations that are happening that are, again, completely passing us by. So it turns out, for example, that when you play this is an experiment done by Yossi Yovel in Tel Aviv. When you play the sound of a buzzing bee near a flower, the flower will produce more nectar and sweeter nectar. The bee doesn't need to be present or touch the flower. The sound will suffice. Yossi Yovel's team also did some really interesting experiments on tomato and tobacco plants, which emit very high ultrasound, well beyond our hearing range. And the nature of that sound differs whether the plant is healthy or whether it's dehydrated or whether it's stressed. They cut some of the leaves on the plants. Well, not only were they able to record those sounds made by the plants, but they then trained an artificial intelligence algorithm that just by listening could tell whether the plants were healthy, needed watering, or were injured. Insects can hear in the ultrasound. So the sound emitted by plants is probably something insects are picking up to infer ecological information about the state of those plants. Now, we already know about complex biochemical signaling in nature. Plants and trees release lots of biochemicals. They can, for example, a tree infested by pests can summon wasps, bodyguards. They've got their own bodyguards on demand through the use of biochemicals. So it turns out that acoustic communication is probably being used as well. There are beautiful examples of bats and moths. Bats use echolocation to hunt on the wing. Moths can jam bat sonar, so on and so forth. On it goes. So there are all these conversations ongoing that we are simply oblivious to. And that's why I like to say sonics, this collection of technologies that helps us listen to nature, is like the new optics. So cast your mind back to several hundred years ago, the invention of the telescope, the microscope. These technologies completely overthrow our worldviews of the time. First of all, humans are no longer at the center of the solar system or the universe, controversial at the time. But also the discovery of the world of microbes was profound because it led people to understand that there were whole worlds out there that we were not able to perceive, but that were really profoundly important for our health, for ecological health. Of course, at the time, Van Leeuwenhoek in the Netherlands, who developed some of these early microscopes, would point them at random things like well water, milk, and we're at that stage. We've just invented these devices. We're going around and listening. We're learning shocking things we don't quite understand. And just like the early inventors of the microscope had no idea they would eventually end up discovering DNA, the code of life with these technologies, we also at the very start of this, I think of it as a new scientific paradigm. We simply don't even know what we're going to discover. We're sort of at the point, it's almost taxonomical. We're going around and recording all of these sounds and labeling them. But for the most part, we don't know what they mean. But when we do, even the little glimmers of insight we have are fascinating. For example, many species make sounds that encode semantic content analogous to words. Elephants have a specific signal for honeybee. They have another signal for dangerous hunters, humans. They have another signal for humans that are not hunters. They can describe us with more specificity than we can probably describe them. Many species have individual names. We only recently realized this. So we're just starting to figure out what all these sounds mean. And every time we learn, it sort of chips away at this human exceptionalism, the belief in our uniqueness.
Okay, so let's back up a minute. Are you saying that there's language involved here?
So that's a controversial question. So most of the people who do empirical research on this topic use the language of information theory. That is, what we study is the communication of information between a sender and receiver. You can distinguish signal from noise, and we know the receiver receives the information because it results in ecologically meaningful behavior. So for example, if you play the sound of an African honeybee to an African elephant, it will engage in very specific defensive behaviors, coming together in a group, showering one another with dust. Elephants are terrified of honeybees because they can get in their trunks and ears and sting. It's one of the only things that will, sort of terrify the mighty African elephant. So through playback experiments, you can determine whether or not your guesses, your hypotheses about the meaning of these signals, and so that if you like, the dictionaries we have of other species communication patterns gradually grow. Now, is that language? Well, here comes the controversy. Many philosophers, linguists, would assert there's something unique about human language. We have, first of all, symbolic content. We're not only using words to describe things in nature, like threats or environmental features. We're describing as abstract ideas. We don't know if other species do that. We also don't know if they have these sort of recursive structures, really complex syntax, and so are able to construct complex ideas, express oral history. Now, here's the tricky thing. Because a lot of the debates in philosophy and linguistics have asserted that only humans have these capacities, very few scientists have dared to go out and look for them. And when they've done so, they've met with a backlash. Many of the researchers I talk about in my book have met with very stiff resistance for even asking these questions. But here's the tricky thing. It is certainly a risk that we might be anthropomorphizing other species if we assume they have language and then look for it. That's a sin of commission, but there's on the flip side, there's a sin of omission. Why would we assume that they don't have any of these capacities? Surely it's more scientifically neutral to simply ask, what if? What if they did have some of these aspects to their language that we consider the defining characteristics within our definition of language? Okay, so now scientists are asking those questions. We'll see what they find. For example, there's really interesting work being done on sperm whale communication, which is very complex, which sounds a lot like Morse code. But beyond that, the other debate that's starting to happen is, why is our definition of language so anthropocentric? Why do we assume that it has to have these certain features in order to be called language, and thus devalue non-human communication systems, which are in fact remarkably complex and rich and very functional to allow them to exist in their environments? So beyond this whole sort of scientific empirical field research endeavor is this really, really deep philosophical question of, do we actually need to redefine the concept of language? And people get into shouting matches over this at conferences. I don't pretend to have resolved that debate, but I think it's time to start asking it again in a new way, because we have a lot more empirical evidence and we have one more thing that the philosophers haven't really taken into account. You and I can never speak like a bat, but our computers can. Generative AI, ChatGPT being the most obvious example, can generate really realistic examples of human speech, audio. It can do the same thing for non-human speech. It is a thought experiment where you take an AI, you train it to speak bat, much like a baby bat learns, and then it starts babbling back in bat and can engage in real-time conversations. We are not far off from developing those tools. And so for this every time you invent a new technology, you invent a new set of risks and responsibilities. And so I think it's also important to start having a conversation about the ethical guardrails that we might wish to put in place for these types of technologies.
Yeah, as a non-academic, my first thought is why does language have to be defined by inhuman terms? Why must there be just one way of speaking? You know, why can't there be various different ways of talking or different ways of communicating? Why must it be the way that only we know?
So, I mean, again, this is a very particular cultural worldview that dates back in a lineage to Descartes and longer. There are many other cultures around the world that wouldn't define language in this way. And that's why I really want to stress, for people who are interested in this, if you go and read the work of Indigenous scholars like John Burroughs or M.A. Craft or Dylan Robinson or Tahu Kukutai, they would all argue that our definition of language is shaped by a particular modern Western scientific worldview that seeks to manipulate the earth and nature rather than understand it. And so in different cultures, different definitions of language might be expressed. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes very beautifully in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about the use in many indigenous languages, including Anishinaabe, about what we consider nouns and objects, like a hill, to be in Anishinaabe, verbs and subjects. So the way one would speak of a hill in Anishinaabe is of a subject, a non-human person that is engaged in the act of hilling. It is to be hilling. It is experiencing the act of becoming and being a hill. And that is how much the language is constructed. So the question you're posing is a good one, but we have to, I think, first of all, be aware that we're kind of trapped in a particular worldview when we ask it, a worldview which may be proven empirically to be incorrect. But within our own little Western modern scientific worldview, I think one of the reasons that we keep asking this question is we're trapped in the sort of the Enlightenment mindset. And the Enlightenment mindset, Descartes asserted, first, I think, therefore I am, as a human. Second, animals cannot reason, they cannot think. And it set up the subject-object binary, the nature-culture binary, the human-non-human binary, none of which perhaps are true, but which became so rooted in scientific culture that to question those paradigms is very, very controversial. And it's, for a long time, a lot of the experimental methodologies that one could use were sort of off limits. And what I think is really interesting about the scientific debate today is we're starting to see some change and some active debate around these concepts. For example, there was the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness that was signed in Cambridge, UK a few years ago. And here's a bunch of quite prestigious scientists from a number of different fields, including neuroscience, medicine, and biology, arguing that we need to redefine consciousness in less anthropocentric terms. And perhaps too, that will also lead to a redefinition of language. But again, this is very controversial, and this debate is far from resolved.
Well, I mean, I've always been fascinated by the idea of sound underwater, and I remember thinking, how many people, average people walking around on the planet, even think about that. And there was a news item a few months ago in England where they talked about the coral reef and how some scientists were planting speakers down in the reefs to try and attract.
That's the work by Steve Simpson at Exeter and one of his research students, Tim Gordon. Okay, so that's really wonderful research. So coral larvae are, microscopic, covered in cilia, no central nervous system. They don't seem like they might be capable of hearing, no obvious mechanism for doing so. Steve Stimson did some fascinating research where first in the lab and then out in the ocean, he tracked fish larvae first and then coral larvae. And what he found, to his astonishment, is that coral larvae can discern between white noise and the sounds of reefs. They'll swim towards the sound of the coral reef. If they're put in a maze, in the lab. And moreover, coral larvae, if given the choice between a random reef and the recording of the sound of their home reef, they will swim towards their home reef. And when he tracked the coral larvae out in the open ocean, what he found is, in contrast to the assumptions of scientists who would assume that coral larvae, they're born in these beautiful mass spawning events a few days after the full moon, these glorious underwater fireworks, they wash out to sea for weeks, months, and eventually make their way back to a coral reef and settle. And scientists thought they were just pushed around randomly by the winds, waves, and currents. Well, it turns out these little microscopic beings, they can actually hear the sound of their home reef and they'll swim back towards it with their little cilia, which sort of puts them in the same echelon of the other animals that do these splendid migrations, like the salmon. The distances that these tiny coral will travel are pretty big in relation to their size. And so how beautiful, somehow their coral larvae are imprinting acoustically on the sound of their reef when they're born, like a coral lullaby, and they remember it. We don't know how. It's a mystery, but we by tagging them, we know they come back to their home reef. Now, what this also means is that even a small amount of noise can be very disruptive to the coral. There was an article in Science, the prestigious scientific journal, a few years ago, titled, pretty grim title, "The Sound of Motorboat Noise is Scrambling Baby Fish Eggs." In many creatures, it turns out, are far more sensitive to sound than we are. That coral larva, its entire body is covered with cilia. And so even a small amount of noise that might be a little bothersome to us can be actually really damaging, particularly in aquatic environments. So the headline in this case was accurate. Motorboat noise from tourist boats was found to be killing baby fish while still in the embryonic stage. It scrambled them in their eggs.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm still processing all the stuff you've just said. Actually, it's just incredible. One thing I'd like you to tell us about actually is about whales, because I know whales are famous for making noises and singing in inverted commas. You spoke in your book about Herbert L Aldridge, who discovered whale music, but on his deathbed.
Yeah, so Aldrich was a reporter for the New Bedford Times. New Bedford is a small town north of New York and south of Boston that a couple hundred years ago was the wealthiest city in the United States because it was the center of the whaling industry. And whales, because their blubber and other whale parts were used for perfume and for lubricant, for lighting oil lamps, a single whale could be worth millions of dollars. It was a very risky endeavor to go whaling, but only a few whaling trips could make you a very rich man. So the mass slaughter of whales was largely run out of New Bedford. Aldrich, in his mid-20s, was told he was dying of tuberculosis. So rather than lie on his deathbed, he decided actually to do something very risky. He was the first journalist to ever accompany the whaling fleet as actually it made its way up into the Western Arctic, the Eastern Arctic already having been hunted out. The whales themselves were so scarce at the time that he thought he was dying. He turned out to live a very long time. The whaling industry was also on its deathbed. So it was sort of the notables of New Bedford funded this dying man to go document their dying industry. So he hops from boat to boat with his little detective camera. And while he's on these boats, he is regaled by tales of the whales singing by Captain Kelly, which Aldrich originally dismisses as, sort of tales to maybe distract a gullible newcomer. But it turns out Captain Kelly is telling the truth. And the whalers, in particular Kelly, they're using the sound of the whale song to hunt down the whales through the ocean. When they catch and harpoon a whale, other whales will come from very long distances, calling back and forth to one another and to their injured kin. And at that moment, Aldrich realizes maybe there's something going on here. Maybe they're communicating. Maybe they're mourning. Maybe there are warnings, and he tries to elicit interest in this fact. Once he is back in North America, where he survives to a ripe old age. But with the advent of industrial shipping, motor noise drowns out the sound of whales, and this knowledge is sort of lost to time, except for a very small esoteric research initiative, highly classified, that is carried out by the US Navy. Because the Navy realizes that it can use this the fact that sound travels very, very far distances underwater to begin tracking enemy submarines, enemy boats, and especially Russian, Soviet Navy movements. And so the legacy of Aldrich is one in which the ocean becomes militarized. The Navy uncovers the secret of whale song. And it's only with the release of whale music, those beautiful humpback whale songs that became a platinum best-selling record, that were played into the UN General Assembly, that actually were put on that golden record that went out into space. So if aliens ever find proof of human civilization, they'll hear a human talking, and then they'll hear a whale singing, right? 100 years later, after Aldrich wrote, that music came to public consciousness and was one of the key things that galvanized the movement to ban industrial whaling just in the nick of time. The whales were almost all gone. And those humpback whale songs, by the way, have gone on to be one of the most studied aspects of non-human communication. We know that those songs are learned. They are aspect of culture. They can be shared across ocean basins. So, a whale singing in Bermuda can be heard off the coast of Ireland. There's lots of sort of cross-cultural exchange between whales, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. For a long time, we assumed that only a few species like whales were vocally active. And the point I make in the book is, now that we're able to listen to all of these species that are making sound above and below hearing range, we're realizing that nearly all species that we have studied are either vocally active or they are receptive to acoustic communication, even plants. So that brings a really interesting hypothesis, which is every living thing is sensitive to sound. The ability to sense sound evolved well before our ability to see, and it's probably a primordial way of communicating ecological information.
Incredible. In the book, you mentioned bioacoustics and ecoacoustics quite a lot. Can you explain the difference and what they mean?
Yeah. So bioacoustics is the science of listening to individual organisms. So the story I just told about whales, we listen to one whale or a group of whales, we learn their songs, we attempt to decode the meaning in those vocalizations. Scientists do research on the bioacoustics of honeybees, of birds, of turtles, of all sorts of species, and there's a lot we can learn. Ecoacoustics, on the other hand, involves recording the sound of entire landscapes or oceanscapes. So a landscape will have a particular sonic fingerprint, if you like. Imagine you're in a forest, you might hear a waterfall, a river, a stream, the sounds of birds or animal cries. The collection of those sounds is called a soundscape. It's also sometimes called soundscape studies. Now, the cool thing about ecoacoustic indices and ecoacoustic recording is it's kind of like the audio equivalent of an X-ray or an MRI. So just like a trained radiologist could look at an X-ray and see signs of disease or health, a trained ecoacoustician can listen or look at the visual renderings of these soundscapes, which are called spectrograms, and see the health or decline of an ecosystem. So for example, a degraded ecosystem will be much less sonically diverse and much less sonically active. So you can actually track the health of ecosystems over time simply by listening to the sounds they make in a far more effective way than by installing cameras, because many creatures are hidden under the bushes or only make sound at night. So the use of ecoacoustic indices to track ecosystem health is now becoming a more widely used tool in conservation. And we can do this with far less interference than sending human observers in.
So if the general public were to be made aware of all of this work going on, and I don't know how that's possible because, you know, I can understand most of what you're saying. Obviously, I need to think about a lot of what you're saying, but do you think that if that information could be kind of transmitted to the general population, would that make them care more about the planet? I know it's a massive question here.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that these technologies and the sounds made by nature can cultivate empathy to the extent that we see self in other. So these technologies have revealed, for example, these little tags that you can put on the backs of whales with suction cups so you don't hurt them. They've revealed that mother whales whisper to their newborn babies because they need to hide them from predators. The bat research I told you about, well, we've learned that, bats, which are often associated in Western culture with vampires or blood-sucking creatures of the night, vectors of disease. So bats are actually much more like us than we realized. They remember favors, they hold grudges, they fight over food and resources, they have individual names which encode gender and identity and kin. They go socially distant and they go quiet. They when they're ill, they trade food for sex. They learn to speak just like you and I did, vocal learning. Their parents speak to them and they babble back until they learn bat language. They learn their adult songs that they use to defend territories. So they express culture, which they pass down through the generations. So all of these things, because we could see self in other, can help cultivate empathy. I think there's another interesting possibility here is because we can now start using some of these sounds to cultivate and restore nature. There's another way for conservation through either reducing noise pollution, or in some cases, some species are responsive to music therapy. So you can play the sounds of healthy reefs on degraded reefs, and that will help attract fish and coral larvae and help bring them back to life. Because we have a new way to care for the world, that also sort of cultivates a sense of fellowship, a sense of kinship rather than ownership. And so it was my hope in writing the book, which is told as a number of accessible stories. The science is very digestible, it's very easy to read, that people would start to develop this sense of, awe and wonder at the beautiful conversations that are going on all around us.
Yeah, noise pollution is something that people again may not necessarily think of as a degrading factor in all of this. And that's another thing that maybe we need to kind of learn more, be told more about the effects of.
Yes. So we know noise pollution is very bad for us. We're animals. The average level of noise pollution in most large urban areas has been demonstrated to increase human risk of heart attack and stroke, stress hormones, as well, cognitive impairment, developmental delays, dementia. There's some studies showing that really living close to the loud highway noise over time can increase your risk of dementia. So we know that noise pollution is really bad for us, but it's even worse for other species, which may be very dependent on acoustic information. So a bunch of researchers in Barcelona just did a fascinating study on what we think is the oldest living thing in the world, Mediterranean seagrass. It's clonal. Some of the colonies are dated to between 100,000 and 200,000 years old. So they took some cuttings from these seagrass, which has been rapidly disappearing, of great concern because it's a carbon sink. It's very important for biodiversity. It's sort of like the equivalent of the tropical or the boreal forest underwater. It's really, really important ecologically. So once they took these cuttings and exposed them to high levels of noise that are analogous to what you might get from a motorboat or a seismic air gun used for underwater resource mining exploration, it turns out that these plants are terribly affected by sound. They have little organelles that they use to orient themselves to gravity, and this loud noise can basically destroy those organelles. They use those, and also damages the fungi that help the plants absorb nutrients. So it's as if you had a loud explosion happen close to you and it rendered you deaf, right? The cilia in your ear are affected, But more than that, that same explosion would, sort of damage your stomach so you couldn't absorb any nutrients, and it would knock you off balance. You wouldn't be able to sense gravity anymore. You couldn't even walk. That's the effect of loud sound on these plants. So that means that we need to start totally rethinking our approach to noise pollution in the oceans, and vastly limiting it in ways we never thought we had to before. And that's really urgent. The only silver lining is, unlike chemical pollution, which can persist for decades or centuries or more, as soon as you reduce noise pollution, the animals, the plants, they actually recover. We saw this during the pandemic, where a lot less shipping, the earth goes quiet, and animal stress hormones dropped. So abating noise pollution has immediate, positive, significant benefits.
Wow. Going back to plants, I mean, you talked earlier about plants and their ability to hear, which I can't get my head around at all. But the fact that they also feel, or it sounds like from your description, the fact that they make particular noises or utterances or whatever when they're cut or what have you, does that indicate that they have some kind of perception outside of what we kind of see them as? And does that mean that vegetarians and vegans will now have to look twice when they chop that lettuce in half or whatever?
Well, yes, a controversial question. So let me start off by saying that for a long time, scientists didn't do this kind of research. And then a number of researchers, notably Monica Gagliano, who's now in Australia, and Heidi Apple at the University of Toledo, have been doing these robust experiments that indicate that plants can discern ecologically relevant information from sound. I'll give you an example of Heidi Apple's experiments. So you take a model organism in biology. In this case, it's just a simple weed called Arabidopsis thaliana. It's widely used, very humble plant. And you play sound. So you can play white noise, you could play Led Zeppelin, right? But you also play the sound of insects chewing on leaves. No insects are present, no plants are harmed. But when the plants are played the sound of the insects chewing on leaves, they release defensive chemicals, which of course you can measure. Now, Heidi Apple did a follow-up experiment where she played the sounds of two different insects. One was a predator of that plant, the other was not. Very similar sounds, but the plants were able to discern and only release defensive chemicals in response to the sound of an insect that was their predator. Now, how did they do that? How is their sense of hearing so nuanced? Well, in this particular case, the plants have little hairs on their leaves. You have little hairs in your ears. That's what's enabling you to hear me right now, right? That the hairs are vibrating, sort of mechanoreception, particle motion in the air. So what researchers surmise, although they're not really fully aware of the mechanism yet, is that the hairs, which are all over the plant's leaves, are also able to vibrate, of course, and that they're tuned to vibrate at the frequency of that predator. Of course, there's an evolutionary advantage. Biochemical information travels relatively slowly and is energetically expensive to produce. But if you're able to sense the sound of your predator chewing on a neighboring fellow plant, and release your defensive chemicals, you're going to do much better. So over time, there's this nice tuning, acoustic tuning between predator and prey, whereby the plant's cilia, they're called trichomes, are tuned or vibrate at that particular frequency. And that creates a cascade then of defensive reactions. Now, what it means is plants can hear with their entire bodies. So their sense of hearing is an order of magnitude more sensitive than our own. But it doesn't necessarily mean they perceive in the way we think of perception, because they don't have neurons. So there is a very big debate in the plant community about whether we should call this, some call it plant neurobiology, some call it plant signaling and behavior. Again, there's this ancient divide between animals and plants in the Western science of biology. And there are many biologists who resist the notion that you could be even asking about whether plants have perception, because they don't, they don't have neurons, they don't have the basic physiology that we would think of as a necessary anatomy for hearing, quote unquote. But there is no doubt that they are capable of discerning ecologically relevant information from sound. It just may not be appropriate to ask sort of anthropomorphizing questions about perception. The result is still a fantastic and interesting result. And yes, the thought that all plants are sensitive to sounds is true, but I will qualify it by saying there are only some sounds that are relevant for plants to hear. They may not be able to hear human music. It's not ecologically relevant for them to do so, but they are able to discern the sounds of specific signals that are ecologically relevant for them, like predators.
And did you say earlier that they can actually make sound as well? So when you walk into wood, we don't hear anything, but if we had that digital technology, we can actually hear the trees and the grass.
Yes. And as far as we know, that's happening simply sort of mechanically. So as water flows through a plant, certain parts of the plant expand or contract, or there are certain physiological processes that occur. And as a byproduct of that, sound is produced. So I just want to clarify, I'm not saying that plants are purposively vocalizing in a way we think of ourselves as vocalizing. This might be a byproduct of sort of biomechanical changes in the plant induced by its physical state of, for example, dehydration versus hydration. Nonetheless, the sounds are present, and if insects can hear at that frequency range, it may contain ecologically relevant information for the insect.
Well, I will never walk into a wood again and look at a tree should I say, I will look at a tree in a very different way from now on after hearing about this. What can ordinary people do to help themselves to appreciate sounds?
There are some wonderful ways to get involved. There are sound walks. There are apps you can use where you're listening to nature's sound. You can be a citizen scientist and label data sets of orca sound or other sounds that scientists need help with. I've put a few links on my website. I think there's a link. I don't know if Claire is going to put that in the chat, or I can put it in the chat, where you can go find out more about these technologies and basically ways to get involved as sort of a citizen scientist. So hopefully that's helpful for people.
Oh, absolutely. This has been amazing, Karen. We're kind of coming up, I think, to our hour deadline even. But let me ask you, if you were to kind of quote or actually name a sound, or a sound that's your favorite, what would it be? And then, a sound that we may not. Don't tell me you've caught what I've got.
You've given me your cold over the ether.
Oh no.
Yeah. A sound that's really caught my attention.
We may not even be able to hear.
Yeah. So
you can tell us anything, basically.
Bat vocalizations, not echolocation. Okay, so bats echolocate. That's like an ultrasound machine you might see in a doctor's office. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about their vocalizations, which are the ways they speak to one another. Those are, of course, inaudible to us, but when you slow them down to human hearing range, they sound like the most curious bird song, but it's not a bird, and it's so melodious and so complex. It's uncanny. It just gives you a sense of how rich their world must be. Of course, we can never hear like a bat because we've slowed down that sound to be at a frequency we can hear. So we could never listen as fast as a bat, but it just gives us a sense of how fast their minds must work to take those very fast, high sounds and be understanding all the information. And so how wonderfully their minds must work, how intricate their minds must be in that world of sound.
Yeah. I must say, I've become even more jealous of birds recently because I've learnt that they never go deaf. Apparently, their cilia, excuse me, as ours die off, there's always replenish.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
I heard that the other day, which was quite fascinating too. And if you could be anywhere in the world, Karen, right now, where would you be? I mean, Canada sounds amazing, but where would you be?
I love where I live. I feel deeply rooted in this place. The Sounds of Life is a book that was written in a place that is immersed in non-human nature. So I know this sounds boring, but I would literally be down at the ocean that's a little distance from my house, um, and watching the sea, because there's something really important about, despite all my talk about digital tech, just being out in nature that's close to you, immersing yourself in it, getting to know it, sort of listening in silence, and yeah, being in place. So I hope people get a chance to go outside today, wherever they are.
I think that's a fantastic answer, and I think you're totally and utterly right. Anywhere is a beautiful place. Just to let you know, Zoomers coming up on Tuesday, the 28th of March. We've got Kegi Karu, who's talking about our relationship with animals over the last 40,000 years. And on March the 30th, a guy called Nick Aitchison will be talking about his journey discovering geese in North Norfolk. And both of these people have books, and there's also one coming up in April as well. Karen, I could speak with you or even listen to you actually for the rest of this evening. You are the sort of person that I'd love to meet. I'd love to go in that office behind you, sit at a table, and spend the whole day with you just listening to you, because I find your work and your knowledge and your subject matter so fascinating. I wish that I was 12 again, and I would actually go to university and study this and actually become one of those people shouting, saying, listen, there's languages that we don't know about out there. So thank you so much for sparing your time today. And what a wonderful book, by the way, guys. You must go out and get. I know someone already has said that they've bought a copy online straight away, but this is a fabulous book. It will open your minds and your eyes to something completely different that hopefully in years to come will be something that we take for granted. But I just hope that this really kicks this off. So thank you very much. Excuse me, Karen.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Be well. I hope you feel better soon. And thanks to everyone for listening today. It was a pleasure.
That's fantastic. And Zoomers, again, thank you very much for your patience and being here tonight to support, or this afternoon even, to support In Conservation With. Hope to see you again real soon. And I hope I'm not coughing as much. And until then, keep looking up and also keep listening.